Okay, now, this, for those of you who know my work, you'll immediately conclude at seeing this that this is the shortest book I've ever written. It's also the most personal. It's a book about my relationship with a person who's been the most important professional influence in my life. As I say in the book, that next only to a writer's romantic partner is his or her editor. And in my case, it's a relationship that has been sustained over 50 years, which is very unusual in the present world, where writers change their editors as often as they change their smartphones. I first saw Rukun 50 years ago when I entered St. Stephen's College as a freshman. He was then a third-year student. And our lives have intersected, interacted, been complementary to one another, and occasionally diverged, spectacularly diverged. We are also very different in our personalities. This book is about him, so I won't be speaking much about me. But I'm combative, argumentative. I used to be too much on Twitter, a little less now. I still give too many Zoom interviews. I'm out there. Whereas he is, over the course of his life, he was shy to begin with, and he's become more and more reclusive, and he now lives on a remote hilltop in Kumaon, from where he edits his books, and where he does not meet authors, because he does not like meeting authors. The author-editor relationship, where it is sustained, there's been a fine film made recently in America about the relationship between the editor Robert Gottlieb and his author Robert Caro, who wrote a magnificent, still unfinished 5-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. And it's a film about their relationship, their conversations, and surely also boozy lunches and many meetings. Rukun and I rarely meet. There was just a brief period in our professional career when we lived in the same city, when we would occasionally go and have lunch in Quality's restaurant in Delhi and have chana bhatura, which is a specialty of the place. But before that and after that, we lived in different cities. We communicate by letters. So this is an account of course, a professional relationship, a person who shaped my career, who made my books, which I'll talk about, but also a personal friendship conducted through correspondence. Not through boozy lunches, not through watching cricket matches, not even through phone conversations or WhatsApp messages, but long letters, to begin with handwritten, then typed, and thereafter an email. So yesterday and today, we exchanged about half a dozen letters on each side. Each letter was 3 or 4 paragraphs long. And I vaguely knew that this was an unusual kind of friendship. I had always known it was vital in my professional life. But that the tenor of the friendship was one that was almost old-fashioned, archaic, and yet something worth retrieving, came to me during the pandemic, when I could not travel. And, before the pandemic, for the 2.5 decades before the pandemic, I would go to Delhi or to Ahmedabad or to London every few months and spend several weeks working in the archives. And now all the archives were close to me, and it so happened that in my cupboards, I had this personal archive of 40 years of correspondence, around which this book is structured. And I quote, as Vikram mentioned in his introduction, much more abundantly from his letters, because they are far more quotable than mine. And I'll quote the letters really towards the end of my talk, and I'll tell, and before I come to the letters, I'll give you a kind of outline of the contours of this friendship and what it has meant to our lives, and what it tells us about the world of literature and the world of publishing, as it has evolved over the last 40 years. Now, Rukun and I are almost the same age. He was born 2.5 years before me. He was born in Lucknow, which was the capital, still is the capital of Uttar Pradesh. I was born in Dehradun, which then was also part of Uttar Pradesh. We grew up, shall we say, in the age of Jawaharlal Nehru, and we are growing old in the age of Narendra Modi. And we first saw each other, and I underline the phrase saw each other 50 years ago in 1974, when I entered St. Stephen's College as an undergraduate. Now, in those days, St. Stephen's College was all male. So there was a hostel of 300 young boys and men. I was in the first year, Rukun Advani was in the third year. And those of you who have been to as college, and particularly to hostel, will recall the aura around the final year student. Of course, there were 2 years still to go. There were people in the MA too. So this was a third year batch, which included some really dazzling talents, whom one already knew would be people who would go far. So the cricketer Arun Lal, who played 16 test matches for India, was captain of the college cricket team. Shwapan Dasgupta was one of the college's best debaters. He was then a Marxist, and he argued the Marxist case with as much dexterity and finesse as he argues the Sanghi case now. There was Parajoy Guha Thakurta, who was, had the same sterling, upright, unimpeachable character then as he has now, and was really interested in investigative journalism. And there were many others I shall not mention. Later became ambassadors, chief secretaries, editors of newspapers, and so on. But by common consent, the two most brilliant third-year students in the college were Shashi Tharoor, whom all of you know about, and Rukun Advani, whom I'm making visible for the first time to most of you through this book. And even then, they were a study in contrast. Shashi was charming, handsome, likable, outgoing. In my first week in college, I was brought on to his election campaign to have him elected president of the college union. He was an even better debater than Shwapan Dasgupta. He ran the quiz club, and he was destined for stardom. Rukun, on the other hand, was a recluse. Shashi was a university topper in history in the first 2 years and was going to top in the third year. Rukun was a university topper in the first 2 years in English and was going to top in the third year. So if you think of the intersection of literature and history, which is what my career has been about, and what this talk is about, these were the two great shining stars, and they were utterly dissimilar. Rukun, as I describe in this book, only had time for people who read serious literature, Hardy, Foster, Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, and who listened to high classical Western music, not Johann Strauss, preferably Beethoven, but at least Mozart. And there were about a dozen people who fitted that bill. And I was, of course, excluded, because at that stage I did not listen to much music, and I really preferred playing cricket to reading. And in those 3 years, because Rukun carried on for an MA, Shashi and some others left overseas. Rukun carried on for an MA. So in 3 years, we were in the same small, self-enclosed community of young men. You know, my room was 50 yards from his. I would pass his room while going to the dining room on the way back. And he never exchanged a word with me, and I was too scared. He was contemptuous of me because he was a scholar, I was a cricketer, and not a particularly good cricketer at that. I batted number 11, was the fifth bowler and the worst fielder in the college team. If I was Arun Lal, he would have at least talked to me. And I was also badly dressed. And he was, I describe in the book the one time he came face to face, where he was wearing a dapper jacket, he had a nicely manicured beard, and he was getting on his motorbike, and I was coming into college in stained, unironed whites from cricket practice, and I said, hello, and he gave me a look of utter disgust. Now, that was where we were in college. Now, Rukun graduated in 1977. The next year, he got a scholarship, and he was the first NLAC scholars to go to Cambridge, where he commenced a PhD on the non-fiction writings of E.M. Forster. And after that, he could have returned to his old job teaching English in St. Stephen's, but he didn't want to, he was distinctly unenthusiastic about teaching bored and confused and not very literate undergraduates. So he joined the Oxford University Press instead. I finished St. Stephen's 2 years after him, whereas Rukun always got a first class first in his BA and his MA. I was an utterly middling student, a low second class in my MA and a medium second class in my BA. Now, there's a certain distinction, a great distinction in being a first class student, like Shashi Tharoor and Rukun Advani, and a certain, shall we say, frisson in being a third class student. But if you're right in the middle, you know that your life is not going anywhere, certainly not as a student of economics, and by that time I had recognized my limitations as a cricketer too. And completely by happenstance, I was in Orissa doing some field work on behalf of the Delhi School of Economics, and a veterinary doctor in Orissa told me about a man called Verrier Elwin, whom he said was like you. He came from far away to work in these tribal highlands. And I went back to my university library, picked up Elwin's autobiography, which is an incredibly moving and delightfully written account of how an Oxford scholar became the leading student and spokesman for India's Adivasis, and decided maybe I have a chance doing sociology and history, and my old university would not give me admission, but IIM Calcutta had a small, obscure, unknown, unrecognized, unhonored program where they had one slot which I got. So I go there in 1980, and in night I'm doing my PhD on forest protest movements in the Himalaya, ending with the Chipko movement, partly because I had grown up in Dehradun. And so while I was the first years of my PhD in Calcutta, 80 to 82, Rukun was in the last years of his PhD in Cambridge, two very different places in terms of prestige. I don't believe we thought of each other. Till in July of 1982, a common friend of ours was getting married in Delhi. This was K. Sivaramakrishnan, now a distinguished professor of anthropology at Yale, who was my classmate, my close friend, and we had a shared interest in cricket and in Hindi film songs. Rukun and he discussed books, and they both came from Lucknow. And they had both studied at the La Martiniere College, a school in Lucknow, a place known for jocks, not for scholars. And I joke in my book that Rukun and Shivi became friends because they were two of only three people known to use the La Martiniere library in that time, the third being the future novelist Alan Seeley. So Rukun and Shivi had a friendship born out of a love of serious literature and classical music and a shared boyhood in Lucknow. Shivi was my undergraduate buddy whom I went with for test matches and so on. And he was getting married at the IIC in their Rose Garden. And the guests were all Shivi's parents' friends and his wife Bala's parents' friends. And I wish the couple came away and wondered what to do. There was no one else I recognized. Rukun was standing about 20 feet away from me, wondering the same thing. He said, I've come, I've wished Shivi, should I stay for dinner or should I push off? When you're young, free wedding dinner is something you think you should stay on for, particularly in those pre-liberalization days. So he was staying on, and I went up to him. And I introduced myself. And we started chatting. And he asked me what I had been doing. And I said, with great excitement that, I started a PhD in Kolkata and working on the Chipko movement. Rukun later wrote about this encounter in an essay, which he published in Outlook magazine. He said there that so as the conversation proceeded, he said, your work seems interesting, and why don't you come to the offices of the Oxford University Press to discuss it further? Now, he said in the essay he wrote many years later that he only invited me out of curiosity. That how, he says there, I have to try to quote it from memory, he said, how did this man, whom I recalled as a failed reincarnation of Erapalli Prasanna, come to, as a weak reincarnation of Erapalli Prasanna, come to writing about village women hugging tree trunks? Had the failure to make the Indian cricket team bowled him clean out of his mind? Now, that is, kind of typical facetious humor that is, what is Rukun's signature. I think he was, of course, curious, surprised, but also intrigued. He recognized that environmental history was a coming field, people were not working on it, and maybe this guy had something to communicate. So I went across to his office, we chatted, I told him about my work. He said, send me your thesis. And in those days, we were talking about the days when I would write by hand and a typist would type it up. And among the few things I have in common with Mahatma Gandhi is a disastrous handwriting. So it went through a few drafts, and then finally it was cleaned up. And one of the stories about these various iterations, which I like telling, was there was a deputy commissioner in Garhwal in the British period who I had regularly quoted in my book because he was talking about peasants and the need to control them and manage them and curb their rebellious instincts. And his name was Macnair. He was a Scotsman called Macnair. The Scots, by the way, were devoted servants of the empire. And my typist, being a South Indian, everywhere made Macnair into MC Nair. Now, anyway, finally all this was cleaned up, and it was a beautifully bound, the old days, a typed thesis, bound in, black, hardbound, with gold lettering, the title, and gold lettering, not unpublished dissertation submitted for the award of, not the nonsense you find on, the kind of completely dehumanized, soulless, anodyne stuff you find on, the internet. Go see my thesis on the internet. So I sent it to Rukun. I posted it, and he had a look at it and said, there may be a book in here. Now, at that stage, I had no clue I would ever write a single book. I had been a failed cricketer, a failed economist. Somehow I had discovered sociology. I had stumbled upon environmental history, which was then an underdeveloped field. I was writing the first serious study of forests in the Himalaya ending with the Chipko movement. I thought I'll get 2 or 3 articles about this. I'll publish something in the EPW, something in some other scholarly journal, and that's it. So I had no clue that I could actually have a book. Rukun had a look at it, gave me 6 or 7 pages of detailed comments, some of which are quoted in my book, and I published my first book, which is called The Unquiet Woods, which was first published by Oxford University Press, and is still in print 35 years later, under the imprint Rukun Advani now runs, called Permanent Black, which I'll talk about a little later. So we then started started a professional relationship, which became also a personal friendship, because The Unquiet Woods was published in 1989. At that year, I moved to Delhi to take up a job, and Rukun was also in Delhi. So those were the years, again recounted in this book, where we would have extended conversations and so on. As I said, my move to scholarship was the product of happenstance, meeting an Odia veterinarian who told me about Verrier Elwin. And over the years, doing my PhD, I got increasingly fascinated with Verrier Elwin because he'd worked on forests, I was working on forests. I got interested in Gandhi, and I found that he had been an intimate of the Sabarmati ashram, and then I later quarreled with Gandhi about the question of celibacy and alcohol, on both of which I was on Elwin's side. So I decided I must pay my dues to this man who changed my life by writing a book about him. So I embarked on what was to become Savaging the Civilized, my biography of Elwin, which went through 7 drafts. It went through, I write usually quite quickly and easily. My Elwin book went through more drafts than any other book of mine except this. We went through even more drafts, which we may talk about in the Q&A. But the reason the Elwin book was so difficult to craft was because a biography is one of the most difficult of literary genres. I was trained as a sociologist. Sociologists write about structure, class relations, the role of technology, the role of the state, the importance of the law. They write about aggregate social forces. Then I became a historian. Historians write about process, how things are changing. But a biographer writes about a personality. He has to enter his subjects' moods, emotions, thoughts, not unspoken thoughts, because a biographer is an artist under oath. He's not a novelist. He has to talk about relationships, personal relationships, romantic relationships, intellectual relationships, rivalries, enmities, and at the same time, set his subject's life against a wider historical and social canvas. It is I have now many years of experience in writing biographies, but at that stage, I found it more difficult than anything I'd done. And it was Rukun who took me through that process, and there are letters in this book about how he did so. And I'll just give you one illustration, or two illustrations that speak to how arduous I found it in writing my Elwin biography. So by 3rd or 4th draft, I was reasonably satisfied with it. I sent it to Rukun. It came back with comments marked in green ink, specific comments, changing a phrase, asking me to look at this reference, alerting me to a poem which was similar to something Elwin had written. And then there was a kind of a summation of his general thoughts on the manuscript. And this summation ended with, "This is fine as a study of Elwin, the scholar and the public intellectual, but where is the human being?" So I said, I must bring in the human being. I went back to my notes. I went back to the archives. I read Elwin's letters to his mother, to his sister, to his friends all over again. And I brought in much more about Elwin's complicated relationship with his mother. He actually came to India partly to flee his mother, and he kept in touch with her, remotely through correspondence, the way Rukun does not want to see me, but is still willing to write to me from a long distance away. But also, Elwin had married twice to tribal women. And the first marriage ended in a disaster. And second marriage was somewhat more successful. He had ferocious intellectual rivalries. His ideas on Adivasi culture were deeply controversial and frequently contested by Indian scholars. So I brought all that in. His relationship with his mother, his sister, his 2 marriages, one terribly tormented, the other reasonably harmonious, his intellectual animosities, and I wrote that all in from my sources into draft number 5, which I sent to Rukun, and this came back a few weeks later, again with many specific comments on style, on language, on phrasing, on structure, and finally the magisterial remark, "This is fine as a study of Elwin, the son, the husband, the friend, but where is Elwin the scholar?" So I went back and wrote it all up, and finally, draft 6 or 7 was published, and actually, effectively, it was Rukun who made me a biographer. Without his I hesitate to say teaching, but without his nudging, without his focused and rigorous and repeated readings, critical readings of my book, I would never have had the courage to take on a subject as complex as Gandhi. Now, so Rukun made me a published historian. He made me a published biographer. And he also introduced me to a 3rd dimension of my work, which I would have never have thought of. And I'm going to read you a letter of Rukun's. written to me in 1988. So as I said, I was a sportsman, he was a scholar. And the more I became a scholar, the more I wanted to disavow my sporting past because I was embarrassed by it. So in 1988, I came back from Yale, where my wife and I were, settled in Bangalore. I wrote Rukun a letter saying, I have resumed playing cricket again with a first division club here, even though I realize that places our friendship as at peril. You may regress to viewing me as a college cricket type instead of an up-and-coming sociologist. And promptly the letter came back, in those days handwritten, 2 days later from Delhi. It said, now that you've regressed to cricket, this is Rukun writing, now that you've regressed to cricket and aren't likely to chuck over sociology, why don't you write us a sociology of Indian cricket? I don't know, don't think anyone's written such a book, whereas that area should, in your case, kill two interests with one stone, so to speak. There must be several very interesting sociological themes to explore, the game being so fundamental to Indian life. Has anyone explored the cultural and historical reasons for the game's hegemonic hold over practically every Indian class, the social backgrounds of our cricketers? This must have changed considerably with commercialization and professionalism, the social psychology of the Indian cricketing audience, the politics of Indian cricket, and no doubt many other questions that you would be able to think of. I hope you'll consider this seriously, if not as an immediate project, then at least something you'll think about and gather material in. Now, this letter was written to me in 1987. 15 years later, I published my book, A Corner of a Foreign Field, which is, I suppose, not just the result of this thought planted in my mind by Rukun, but also many subsequent conversations with him about writing and including about sport. Actually, about just last thing about sport. To illustrate how different Rukun and I are as personalities. When I was young, I played cricket. I was obsessed with cricket. For 10 years, all I did was play cricket. You know, in St. Stephen's, we played 50, 60 matches a year. And in school and later with a club. And cricket is a sociable, gregarious sport, much more than any other. Football is also a team sport, but the fullback is never in conversation with the center forward. It's the pace of the game is too fast. At cricket, you're at first clip, you chat to the wicketkeeper. Overstaying, you put your hand over your friend who's bowling. A wicket falls, and then you're in the dressing room chatting, right? Now, so I played cricket. Rukun also liked one particular sport a lot, which was golf, which you can play alone. Anyway, so that's what Rukun has meant to me professionally. You know, he made me a historian, a sociologist, a biographer, and a cricket writer. What makes Rukun a great editor, and there are many examples in this book, which I won't read out to you, is that he understands language and he understands thought. You have editors who are very good at cleaning up your prose. But there are very few editors, and none I know, and I work with editors all over the world, who have a PhD from Cambridge and can understand thought, and who have worked with some of the finest sociologists and historians who have ever written on India, you know, both Indian and foreign. And I think that's what really makes him a great editor, as I hope you'll see from some of the things written in this book. Now, I published my first book with Rukun in 1989. For the next decade, I had a very close professional and personal relationship with him, which was also a close and professional relationship with his publisher, the Oxford University Press, which was then at the height of its fame and its glory. You know, the OUP in India in the decades of the 80s and 90s was transforming the landscape of Indian scholarship. Much of what we understand about this society, its history, its politics, its culture, its sociology, is a result of the authors published by the OUP in the 80s and the 90s. I'll give you a few names. Robina Thapar, Veena Das, M.N. Srinivas, Andre Bete, Jean Drèze, Amartya Sen, Thomas Troutman, Richard Eaton, the whole subaltern study school, Partho Chatterjee, David Hardiman, Ramachandra Guha. And the OUP was like a home, second home for me. It had offices everywhere. It had first-rate and capable staff. And then in the late 90s, the OUP entered its steady and now it appears irreversible decline, which I speak about in this book, which is partly structural to do with Thatcherite compulsions. The bottom line became more important than high-quality scholarship, which should not be the case for a university press, and partly the result of a managing director of OUP India who was insecure about the fact that his reclusive, shy editor was regarded in greater regard by his authors than him. And so I described all of it in the book and the ugly situation. By then, Rukun was married to Anuradha Roy, who's now a well-known novelist, but at that stage was a young editor, extremely good, almost as competent as Rukun, and with a much more winning personality, I should add. They were forced to leave the OUP. And they set up their own publishing house called Permanent Black, which Rukun first said, because there was also an element of colonialist discrimination in how they were removed, which is talked about in this book. Rukun said he wanted to call it Kalu for Men, since there was already a publishing house called Kali for Women. He was not so spoofy to do that, but he did register his company on All Fools' Day, 1st April, which surely was not a coincidence. Okay, so he started this publishing house called Permanent Black, and the second book they published was one of mine. It's called An Anthropologist Among the Marxists and Other Essays. And in fact, I owe my subsequent life as an essayist also to the experience of working with Rukun Advani. Now, I no longer, it's many years since I published a book with Rukun, because as I say in a footnote to this book, Permanent Black is first class in editing, but third class in marketing and sales. And by now, I don't really need the kind of hand-holding editor that Rukun was, and I mostly can write my own books, except for this one, which, because it's so personal, it required many revisions and iterations from close friends. So I started publishing with trade presses, with not niche academic presses. But Rukun remains my closest literary confidant. And in my book, because in the interest of time, I won't, you'll have to buy the book to see how, even in my journalistic work, which he is still the first person I go to for comments, and how he reshapes it. There are two examples I'll give you right here. I wrote a long essay called The Rise and Fall of the Bilingual Intellectual, which I'm very proud of because it was published in the Economic and Political Weekly, and later in my collection, Patriots and Partisans. It identified a particular literary phenomenon and its decline. India once had many bilingual intellectuals, people who wrote in Kannada and English, Bengali and English, Marathi and English. And over the decades, there'd been a separation of discourses with people like me and Shashi Tharoor and Amitabh Ghosh and Mukul Keshavan and Arundhati Roy writing only in English and others writing only in Kannada or Malayalam, which was not the case with the earlier generation. So Mahashweta Devi could write in English as well as Bangla. Girish Karnad could write in English as well as Kannada. So I wrote this essay, which I'm quite proud of. But when I said Rukun a draft of the essay, it came back with 16 numbered paragraphs, each containing a deep sociological insight, and I've reproduced that whole letter there, because as I said, it should really have been a co-authored essay. The second example, also in this book, is about an article I wrote in 2013, anticipating Narendra Modi's authoritarian impulses as and when he became Prime Minister. And that too, at least 2 paragraphs of that essay were, as I say in a letter to Rukun, Guha masquerading as Advani. Now, I did want to leave time for questions, but I would like to read out some examples of Rukun's satirical prose from his private letters. So I'm going to read out 2, with your permission. One of the differences between Rukun and me is that I'm a patriot and he's a skeptic. I would like to think that somehow, somewhere, we can recover our original idea of India. And he thinks, following E.M. Foster, that nationalism is humbug, a pretense to confuse people, and what really matters are friendships. In 2010, I wrote Rukun. There was the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which was a wonderful archive, had been taken over by some Sonia Gandhi stooges, Gandhi family stooges, who had destroyed a very well-run historical archive. And they produced a calendar, which ran from 1st April to 31st March, a bird calendar on glossy paper, at a time when what the archive needed was money from microfilm machines. So I wrote an anguished letter to someone I knew in the governing body, and I copied Rukun, who wrote back, Ram, hi. I too got this wonderful NMML calendar. I don't know why you are so critical of it. I love it for its appropriateness. Surely you can see that it is the only calendar in the world which starts with 1st April. Such an auspicious day for the dispensation running the NMML. So heartwarmingly self-deprecating of them to alert us to the fact of all fools. Such a nice thumb-nosing of Oxford's All Souls. To think of printing a calendar which begins in the middle of the year is breathtakingly imaginative. Only an Indian Babu of the highest pedigree could have thought of this. It can set a wonderful precedent for Babudom generally and be sent off to all ministries as a reminder that the Christian era is passé. The BJP will love it. Others who have to learn to move with the times will learn that a year isn't a year unless it is seen as a financial year. Future editions of this work of brilliance can show January in red, February in orange, and March in green to remind Babus to rush forward and spend their budget. I'm in a tizzy thinking of all the many possibilities opened up by this calendar. A visionary new direction has been given to the institution. You are wrong to cavil at it. Now, I'll read out one more excerpt, and then I'll make a few concluding remarks. This has to do with Rukun's explicitly elitist view of publishing. After he retreated to Ranikhet, excuse me, he would occasionally come to Delhi. Now he doesn't at all. Shortly before the pandemic, I introduced him to a young publisher who had come from London, who was a very capable, bright person. And they had lunch, and they hit it off. And inevitably, it resulted, the aftermath was disappointment. So a few weeks after our meeting in Delhi, Rukun wrote me this letter from Ranikhet about the publisher I had introduced him to. The young publisher, your friend, the young publisher, has written a surprisingly stupid review in Outlook, praising Chetan Bhagat. Your friend seems to think that anything that sells 1 million copies must have value. Whereas no one would have noticed any value in Bhagat if he'd sold only 5,000. I think your friend has got the wrong end of the stick totally. First, because Bhagat is an extension of the magazine buying culture of this country, where 95 bucks seems worth blowing up if a herd of fellow nerds is blowing it up too, and you don't want to seem left behind by the Joneses. Second, 1 million fools buying Bhagat, like the millions of Indian males who piss in full view, only suggests that civilizationally, the vulgar middle class's domination of India is absolute, to the extent of beguiling this otherwise sharp individual. Publishers become suddenly amenable to jettisoning standards when they think of the effect of 1 million copies on their own publishing program. I'm almost grateful for being stuck bang in the middle of unreadable elites whose books sell only a few copies, at least there is no pressure on me to compromise by singing hosannas to Bhagat or Shobha De. Now, as I said, he was always shy and reclusive, and I described the process where even in the OUP, he would not take his authors out for lunches, except oddities like me, because I was so different from him that once we struck up a friendship, and despite our many disagreements, which are in this book, we have carried on, probably because we don't live in the same town, we never see each other. Though my book ends with the last time I saw him, which was just before the pandemic. And it was April of 2019. He lives in Ranikhet with Anuradha Roy. And Anu comes for literary festivals. She was in Calcutta last week, and she goes and speaks about her novels. But he never leaves. Virtually never leaves. He once went on a long pilgrimage to Vienna to pay homage to Beethoven, which is described in this book. And there also there's some lovely letters about what Beethoven meant to him. And he talks about going to Beethoven's grave. And he says, I left a 1 rupee coin on his grave so that he would know I was a Sindhi, that a Sindhi had come to worship him. Now, which is kind of self-deprecating humor. But anyway, so I went, in 2019, I was in Nainital, where I was staying with my friend, the great historian Shekhar Pathak, with a few people Rukun is still willing to meet. And I was going from Nainital to Kausani on a research trip. Now, those of you who know Kumaon would know that from Nainital, you would have to drive more or less via Ranikhet to Kausani. So I told Rukun I'm coming, and he said, come and have lunch. So the previous day, I was with Shekhar Pathak, and who was an extraordinary, brilliant, deeply humane, and extraordinarily widely traveled scholar. Anyone interested to read his great book on the Chipko movement, now out in English. And Shekhar was talking about Rukun and seeing him last time. And he said this phrase in Hindi about visiting Rukun in his den in Ranikhet. He said, "Jitna Rukun chup hai, utna uska kutta bhonkta hai." So it kind of made me just want to go. So we went. I took this on my way to Kausani. I went, had lunch with him. And Anu was there, and so was our old OEP friend Rivka. And we went to a nearby hotel for lunch with a view of the snows. And he drove me back to my cab, which is going to take me to Kausani. And he said, I wish you'd stayed longer. And at that stage, I wished too. But as soon as I got into the car, and in 10 minutes, I realized that I'd done just the right thing. I'd seen he was happy in his reclusiveness, but to stay anymore would have been an imposition. Now, I began with St. Stephen's College, and I'm going to end with St. Stephen's College and Shashi Tharoor. There's a letter written to me. There are many letters written to me by Rukun in which Shashi figures. And I've quoted only one in this book. And the case of some other letters, like the publisher I mentioned, I've redacted names, but not here, because Shashi is a public figure. And I felt it was appropriate that. But I'm not going to read you that letter that Rukun has written about Shashi. I'm instead going to read you why they are so different. Shashi Tharoor and Rukun Advani. Let me start. Let me start and then, with this. As I said, a Stephanian Rukun was ambivalent about was his classmate Shashi Tharoor. Both ranked first in their batch, Tharoor in history, Advani in English, but there the resemblance ended. Shashi was, even in college, very much a public man, debating, acting, becoming president of the Woodhouse Society and of the Quiz Club before being elected president of the college union. He was charming and outgoing, but from the start, ferociously ambitious. Shashi wanted to make a mark in the world quicker and more dramatically than any Stephanian or perhaps any Indian before him. Whereas Rukun had no ambitions to become well known, in college all he wanted to do was read, listen to music, and have one-on-one conversations with friends. In the OUP, all he wanted to do was edit books. While he gloried in the success of his authors, he never remotely wanted to take any credit for this. As we have seen, this inwardness and reclusiveness deepened even further when he retreated to Fananicate and ran permanent black from there. Then I quote Rukun's letter to Shashi, and which you will have to read for yourself. And then I'll just read out 2 paragraphs, and then I'll end my talk. As I have said, Shashi and Rukun were contemporaries in St. Stephen's. Superficially, they were alike, both brilliant, both very widely read, each far removed in his interests from the sports type I myself was in college. Even some of their literary traits overlapped. Both admired Woodhouse and Orwell, for example, yet in terms of character and personality, no two Stephenians could be so radically dissimilar. I suspect most readers of this book will know Shashi Tharoor's public profile. To show how Rukun Advani is, as it were, his absolute other, I must take recourse to the words of the most gifted of all Stephenian prose stylists, Mukul Keshavan. And here a quote from Mukul Keshavan follows. Here it is. This is Mukul, not me. Rukun has no interest in impressing others. This sounds impressive, but isn't. Because this freedom from human neediness isn't down to modesty or reticence or some karmic insight into the general Maya-ness of things. It is simpler than that. So simple that he can't take any credit for it. Rukun doesn't like people. It explains everything about him. This is why he lives in the hills. This is why he loved his dog Biscuit. Without reservations, he wasn't human. He loves Beethoven because Beethoven is dead, and his genius can be electronically reproduced without the agency of other people. It's why he deals in books. Books are forms of disembodied intelligence. They hold out the promise of profundity or pleasure without people attached. Thank you. I'll take some questions. I'll stand there. Will you put on the lights? Yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm Ziad. So my question to you will be about the cooking of books, of course. How do you think your writing journey has impacted by Rukun and his ideas? Because sometimes working with an editor who is very different from you will probably find, gaps in your writing and, and something that will help fill the gaps that a person doesn't have. It's like having a marriage of sorts,
yeah.
With your editor. How do you think that has impacted your writing and your journey in?
Rukun disavows his role in making me a published author. He says I exaggerate, I'm sentimental, I'm affectionate. But there's no question that without him, I would not have done the kind of work I've done. And the other people too. I mean, the other, OUP authors, historians, sociologists, whose books have been reshaped by him, maybe he hasn't cultivated the same kind of personal friendship that he has with me, for a variety of reasons, because we share a similar kind of temperament. We also have similar, political and cultural literary views. We have the same tastes, but we disagree too, right? So now, the important thing about Rukun, there's a sentence in my talk. He understands language and he understands thought. It's a scholarly editing is a different kind of game, right? So, it means you have to understand sociology, politics, class structure, how the argument of one chapter leads into another. It's not just about cleaning up somebody's prose. But Rukun is also supremely good at that. There's some scholars who would only like to write for other scholars. Rukun and I have a shared distaste for jargon. There are a few passages in this book about academic jargon and our common views about them. You know, I once wrote an essay. I'll tell you a story. I once wrote an essay critiquing subaltern studies in the EPW. And after I wrote that essay at Teen Murthy Library, a JNU professor met me. And I say that JNU professor was a Marxist, an orthodox Marxist who normally would not talk to me because some people in this room, it may come as news to some people in this room, but I've been a critic of orthodox Marxism longer than I've been a critic of Hindutva, for the record. So he said, you know, but he liked my takedown of subaltern studies because subaltern studies was heretical Marxism. So this professor, JNU professor said, you know, I really liked what you wrote about subaltern studies. I made photocopies, because this is pre-PDF, and circulated among my students. And I told them, don't be taken in by how well it's written. It's still saying important things. Which I think is the strangest and nicest compliment I ever got. Now, this is partly because of Rukun. So, you know, Ziad, you see, next to you, there's a scientist sitting, right? Now, the work she did, the research she did, could not have been communicated to you and me without utterly dumbing down, without ridding it of its originality, its sophistication, its nuance, its complexity. If you're a scientist, if you're a mathematician, and if you're a philosopher, I exclude economists because I don't know what is economics, is science, is religion, is there something else? Is this nothing, is it myth? But history and anthropology are two scholarly disciplines where the rigor of your research should not impede wider communication. You know, if you read, you know, the great historian E.P. Thompson, I mean, or Edward, you know, or Andre Bethia among Indian sociologists, for example, right? So I think, or Jim Scott, one of the great scholars of the world, I mean, he writes beautifully, but he's making profoundly original. You know, he's not just a workaday writer. He is not a narrative historian just telling stories, you know. I mean, there's room for all of that. So Rukun was particularly important for that, you know. And I think that's something is very rare. Today, what's happening, the whole publishing world has changed. So even the copy editing is careless. Now, you know, again in this book, and I was very lucky because he's also such a well-read man, right? In my Elwin biography, there is a letter which I write to him where I say, one secret, you know, I describe something of Elwin's as a combination of a poem by Larkin and Handel's Messiah. And I say, it must remain a secret between you and me that I have neither read Larkin nor heard the Messiah. Now, so I think of course, after a certain time, I didn't really read Rukun, you know. So India after Gandhi, he didn't look at, or my Gandhi biography. We chatted, and of course, obviously all the training. So that kind of, so because he was a scholarly editor interested in language and prose and style, but also had a rigorous analytical mind. That's what makes him unique. No, he will disavow. He'll say Ram is sentimental, he's generous, he thanks me for no reason. You know, any clever, opportunistic publisher, when he heard about Ram's PhD topic, would have taken him. So, but he is really very special. I'll just say one last thing, and then I'll talk about. In the years we worked together, I usually took his advice, except once. He wrote, there was someone here from the Indian Review of Books, which is wonderful to see, which is a great magazine published out of Chennai. And Rukun once wrote in the essay in the Indian Review of Books, which is called Academics as Writers. And it was supposed to be a scholarly essay. It was a shameless piece of Stephanian nepotism. He wrote about Amitav Ghosh, Mukul Keshavan, and me. And he said all three have advanced research degrees. You know, Amitav and I have PhDs, Mukul did a MLit by research in Cambridge, and they all write well. That's what makes them distinctive. Not that they're my friends, that's what makes them distinctive. But anyway, that's okay. Now, then he said, Ghosh has written novels, Keshavan has written novels, and his type, Guha, wrote a novel because he has both the intellectual and the literary equipment to do it. And I said, Rukun, I said, I have to write a novel. I have to write a novel. So I went to my desk and I tried to write some pages, and I wasted 3 months of my life. Before I found out, and I describe how I found out, how I found out, it would be a disaster. So, you know, I say, the one time I did not accept his advice, I'm grateful for it, and my readers are probably even more grateful. Yeah, Saras. Yeah. Take away, masters.
Since you're talking, about his time at OUP and the glory days of that publishing house, to what extent was, I think, a much ignored editor, Ravi Dayal, influential in Mukul's development?
So thank you, Sarat. So there's a few pages on Ravi Dayal. Ravi Dayal was, for those of you who would not know him, he made OUP move from textbooks and encyclopedias to scholarly work. So he was a real pioneer. He realized the potential for scholarly writing in India well before Rukun. So, and OUP was well known for publishing natural history, like Salim Ali, Jim Corbett, Verrier Elwin, English language textbooks, and the older people in this room would have read some of this. And then when people, some of the names I've given you, Ashish Nandi, Veena Das, Ramila Thapar, all of them became well known. Ravi Dayal realized that the OUP has to tap these emerging, what in the 60s and 70s were emerging brilliant scholars, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and he developed a scholarly list along with other editors, including for a few years Girish Kandad, who worked with the OUP, Charles Lewis, there was Adil Taibji, Salima, some outstanding editors, and he recruited Rukun. And then Rukun took the list further. And I talk about Ravi and his contributions. And then Ravi, like Rukun, left OUP to start his own imprint called Ravi Dayal. So absolutely. But, it's like, so I think without what Ravi had done, Rukun could not have, in nurturing and building OUP, Rukun could not have taken it to the next level. But having said that, I mean, due respect to Ravi, whom I knew reasonably well, it's the quality of Rukun's scholarly training and temperament that made him distinctive from anyone else. I think that's, though he will again disavow it, he reveres Ravi, and I quote what he writes about Ravi in this book, including the egalitarian, attitude he cultivated in the OUP, where everyone ate the same food and all of that. So absolutely. So like you have, I suppose you could draw an analogy with some successful corporations, where you need someone to found it and someone to take it to the next level. But in this case, of course, then a third person came who destroyed it altogether, which is really very sad. Yeah, Ajit.
Ram, going by Mukul Keshavan's assessment, observation that Rukun does not like people, how did you react to your idea of publishing this book?
So actually, if I may, that was obviously said partly for effect. Rukun does like people, and selectively, he doesn't like meeting them, but he has affection for many people, not just me. And I'll answer your question, Ajit, but let me read out a passage I want you to read out, which is about Rukun liking some people and all that he will do for them. There's a scholar called Peter Hees, who's a great scholar of Aurobindo, who's an American who spent the bulk of his adult life in the Aurobindo ashram, organizing the archives and writing a series of landmark works on and around Aurobindo. And when the Congress government is in power, Peter Hees' visa extension was denied, possibly because of some intrigue, possibly because of general paranoia, possibly because of some visa intrigue within the ashram. People were rivalrous about Peter Hees. Peter Hees had published 2 books with Rukun. One is, Rukun had maybe never met him, he had corresponded with him, maybe had one lunch. And he wrote to me. He was so upset that Peter Hees' visa was denied. This would be in 2011 or 12, when the UPA was in power. He wrote to Jairam Ramesh. He wrote to Nenjot Lahiri, who was a friend of Jairam Ramesh, and also Jairam Ramesh was a minister. And Jairam Ramesh was that rare minister, and certainly unique in the Indian context, not so unique in the British or French context, who both read and wrote serious works of history. So he got Nenjot Lahiri to write to his friend, well-known historian of ancient India, to write to Jairam saying, you have to talk to your fellow Tamil P. Chidambaram, the Home Minister, to get the visa renewed. Then he wrote to Upinder Singh, another well-known historian of ancient India, incidentally the daughter of Manmohan Singh was then Prime Minister, and even more remarkable than Jairam, was merely a minister who read and wrote serious books. Upinder was the daughter of a Prime Minister who never used influence of any kind for anyone, least of all for herself. But Rukun said you have to make an exception because this is a fellow scholar. So you have to tell your father to somehow lean on Chidambaram to get the visa extended. But he was not content, and he wrote to me. He said, you have a column in the Hindustan Times. Write a piece on the importance of foreign scholarship on India, starting with Verrier Elwin, mentioning Jean Drèze, and ending with Peter Hees and why we need him in India. So I wrote the piece, but he orchestrated it. So all of this was done. Now, and I don't know which of these three initiatives had the most impact. As you can guess, it was not mine. But Peter Hees' visa was renewed. Whereupon he wrote me a gracious letter of thanks. Peter Hees, whom I'd never met. And I wrote to Rukun saying, I said Peter's letter to Rukun saying, you know, although you see yourself as a post-national, withdrawn from the world, know-it-all and see-it-all cynic, you are in your own way quite public-spirited and, dare I say, patriotic. If Peter stays on, he will really have you to thank most of all. So Rukun wrote back seeking to correct me. He said, it was not patriotism that nurtured me. Quite the opposite. A Foster-influenced view of life in which the individual's fate is more important than the nation's. And even more important when the individual is a decent underdog. Hees is a low-key scholar writing high-quality history for the love of it, sucking up to no one, never trying to thrust himself into the limelight for all the fine stuff he's writing quietly in the backwaters. His kind of person made sense to me. I was simply instinctively sympathetic and did what I could. The nation may ... blasted to perdition, benefited incidentally. Now, so this is another incident in the book where I was going to Kabul for a meeting. And he wrote Sujata an anguished mail. And then he called her and he said, look, you can't go, don't tell him to go. I mean, don't you know that Daniel Pearl got killed by jihadists? If somebody's getting the Nobel Prize, they can go, but he's just going to hang around with pista traders and empty-headed Stevenian diplomats. We showed that he cared. You know, I went nonetheless, you know, because but he does care for a few people. And he occasionally, like when I met him in Ranikhet, he's happy to meet. He does not be overburdened by it. So, you know, if you write him an effusive letter of thanks, he'll reply courteously. Then you write him a second letter, twice the length, there'll be silence. Now, turning to your question about the book, he approved of it broadly. The 14 people thanked for comments. He did really make many structural comments. He added a few paragraphs here and there, which are appearing under my name, as offered me the case. But mostly I wrote it. I got wonderful comments from friends, scholars, and others who are mentioned in the book. Occasionally he advised me to redact a name. Shashi's name is not redacted. One or two other names are also not redacted. But now he's probably has mixed feelings about reviews it's getting. And he wrote to me yesterday, he said, when is the first hostile review coming? I'm looking for it. With some anticipation. Because I know, you know, people will say, as I say early in my preface, you know, people will see it as self-indulgent, elite male, self-indulgent celebration of elite male privilege and so on. Yeah, this particular book, he's not. His imprint is relatively light. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, just curious about the title. I mean, did you have to think much about it?
Well, the title has an odd gestation. And a friend pointed out early on that it's completely accidental. I didn't realize that Sheila Dhar, who was edited by Rukun, published The Cooking of Music. But that's about music and food. Well, I'll say, I can say it for the record. It was a bad joke originally. I think it works. But I'll tell you how it originated. So as I say that, next, particularly because of my long relationship with Rukun, which is very rare for writers today who change the editor with every book, He's been the most important person in my life, apart from my wife, right? Now, I had an uncle who was an English sahib. He had studied at Oxford, he was in the Imperial Services, and he started eating meat because even though, by tradition he was Shura. And he had, before he married, a mug cook. Now, how many here know what a mug cook is? That's very few, so I'll have to explain the rest. The mug cooks were loved by British sahibs because they were Buddhists who came from Arakan, and they had no scruples about cooking either pork or beef. A Hindu cook would not cook beef, and a Muslim. So mug cooks were what the sahibs had, right? And so my uncle was a sahib, had a mug cook. And then he married my aunt. He was my atte's husband. And then he and my aunt had some kind of disagreement, whereupon the mug cook went to his boss and said, the most important person in a sahib's life is his mug cook. You choose between your wife and me. Now, my uncle was sensible enough to sack the mug cook. And he got a second mug cook who was surly but never threatened to resign. Now, so originally my joke was, Rukun is my mug cook. All right. But it was too cheesy, so I dropped it. But it's still the cooking of books, how books are cooked and shaped and, and refined and so on. And the different ingredients that go into it and tasted, yeah.
Yeah, Ram, you've been speaking about the art of writing good biographies. Now that you've written a memoir, what do you think is the good art of writing a good memoir?
So there is no art of writing a good memoir. Because memoirs are intensely personal. Some work, some don't work. They elicit very diverse reactions, as this book surely will. But one of the things that Rukun has given me is the desire to work with younger writers and other writers and pass on all that he may have taught me. So, Nandan Nilekani was here, and 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, he and I started the New India Foundation, which gave me the chance to work with younger writers, and now we have 33 books out by younger writers, and now a new set of trustees is running it, and Nandan and I have withdrawn. And I've also started a series called Indian Lives, of biographies written by first-class scholars. A magnificent book by Ashoka was the first, and a very fine book by Chitralekha Joshi on Sheikh Abdullah. A book on Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay is following by Nico Slate. Is the first good biography of the most remarkable Indian woman of the modern era. It will be released here by Nico Slate on March 8th. So please come for it. So I think that is something I'll work on. Memoirs are intensely personal. And, how they resonate, but like, for example, I've written a biography of Elwin and a biography of Gandhi and some other biographies and shorter biographies. Most of my biographical subjects have written autobiographies. This is a memoir. This is not an autobiography. There's nothing about my family and both my parents and my relatives and my children. They hardly figure, So it's really, and nothing about political controversy and so on. It's a memoir. But even I say, when I wrote on Elwin and then on Gandhi, I said that an autobiography is a preemptive strike against a future biographer. Right. Now, memoir is not that, but it's still selective, and so it's, and I think I wrote a cricket memoir, and now I've written this. I don't think I'm not sure I'll ever publish a full-fledged autobiography. I might one day write a memoir of my journey as a biographer, which is more scholarly. But those are very personal and will have, so it's hard. You can't lay down laws or maxims or directions or guidelines on memoirs. Yeah. I will come to you.
So is this in some way you're showing gratitude to Rukun, you think?
Well,
deeply.
It's not just that. It's not just that. So please read it. It's much more than that. But it's also, he says it's the longest thank you note in history, published. Okay. Well, it's much more than that. It's an account of friendship, publishing, argument, debate, the changing intellectual and political landscape over India 60 years. And the scaffolding are our letters. So because this archive was there, it's not just a thank you note. With the other people with whom I've also had intimate relationships, teachers of mine, who shape me, but I don't have this correspondence. So it's a memoir. It's a memoir. It's a memoir of friendship, publishing, literature, and so on. Yeah, yeah. But it's a memoir in which, Rukun is essentially the more important person. You know, you have memoirs written by editors about authors they've worked with. You know, someone, V.S. Naipaul's editor has written about, and so on and so forth. This is different. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the session, sir. Since you've had a fairly long relationship with Mr. Advani, and India sort of witnessed fundamental structural transformation during the same time period, how do you think that change, along with sort of the growing culture of anti-intellectualism, has affected the nature of your correspondence as well as scholarly literature and the publication of it in India?
So some of how it's affected scholarly literature is there in the book, you know, both in the preface and later on. This is as I said, it's the shortest book I've written, right? While I was writing this book, I took the precaution of accepting all I felt interesting from our correspondence. You know, not how are your children, what is happening, whatever, rulers are ... not. And it's, the file is now 200,000 words. This book is 50,000 words, right? One day I will gift it to an archive. There are lots of other reflections about many other things, including politics and anti-intellectualism and historiography particularly, changes historical writing and so on. But all that is there in the background. Some of that is there in this book. Yeah, I mean, it's just, because publishing is very different nowadays. As I said, it's normally face-to-face, and here it's all about letters. I mean, the last week, sometimes you have very long. So, for example, I won't take the name, but about 2 months ago, I happened to meet an Indian writer who's reasonably reclusive between Rukun and me, whom both of us enormously admire. In fact, both of us think he's the greatest Indian writer in English of our generation. And both of us have had different encounters with him, but he's hardly ever meets anyone, and he happened to meet me in Delhi. And I wrote Rukun like an 8-paragraph mail on our meeting. He replied with a 12-paragraph mail on what made that writer distinctive, and X, Y, Z. And this carried on for 3 days. So there's a lot of that, but that is really, that would be too self-indulgent to put here, you know. So, but one day I hope, you know, it'll all be there for people to see. Yeah. Yeah.
You spoke of Mr. Advani's take on publishing and how it's...
On? Publishing, yeah.
You spoke of Mr. Advani's take on publishing and how it's elitist along the lines of Mr. Ezra Pound too, but what are your takes? And the second question I have is, do you still dream about contesting from Dehradun?
Well, do I have to answer the second question? First of all, well, no one will get the reference. I wrote a piece, I'll come to you. I should answer it since it's been asked. In 2014, before the elections, I think, shortly before the elections, I wrote a piece called My One Night Stand as an Aptard. You know, the Ahmadi party was then becoming, kind of influential and so on. There's idealism about it, and people here know that I'm almost as disgusted with the Congress as with the BJP, and have been for many years. And I dreamt I was going to stand from my hometown, Dehradun, and in my dream, two well-known intellectuals whom I respected, one of whom was fighting on an AAP ticket, had asked me to stand. And I got up in the morning, I was in Houston, and I called my closest friend, the late Kesav Desiraju, and my wife, and they both told me it was a daft idea. And I stopped it. Now, there's a footnote to that. In 2018, after I finished the second volume of my Gandhi biography, I had the same dream. And the first time I had it, I was alone in Houston. The second time I had it, I was alone in Bangalore, and my wife and children were somewhere else. I said, now this is done. I'll never write such a fat book again. Let me give it a go, you know. And I dreamt that I was traveling the old bylanes of my hometown and going here and improving my Hindi. And then I got up with a start. I said, shit, what should I do? And then I couldn't sleep. And then I said, let me write, let me do it. And at least a memoir was mentioned. A memoir will come out of it. And I gave it a title also. Doomed in the Dune. I forget the subtitle. Doomed in the Dune. A sentimental writer's quixotic bid to win election from his long-abandoned hometown. So that was that. Now your first question, how is the publishing? There's some good things about, as I said, you need marketing, you need publicity, you need visibility. But rigor and is paramount, for a book to last. Arthur Koestler, a writer some of you might still read, once said, I would exchange 100 copies of my book today, 100 readers of my book today, for 10 readers in 10 years' time, and 1 reader in 100 years' time. So it's hard to tell young writers that, they want instant gratification, fame, they want celebrities to launch their book, they want to be photographed with politicians. But ultimately, a writer must be driven by that. The publishing world encourages this. They say, take a selfie with a film star, with a cricketer, with a politician, with a prime minister, with a chief minister. And I can empathize with that because I grew up in a different era and I was able to make my way without it. Yeah.
So you did mention, it is of course not a biography and a memoir instead, but how much of it is portraying Mr. Advani as the scholar and or the editor in this case, and how much of it is as your friend?
So it's more the first and less the second, but the elements of both. You'll see when you read it. They're more that, it's a conversation about ideas, about books, about style, about language, about structure. And there's some personal remarks too. I mean, the 200,000 word file I have, which I hope, it's also about friends, not just, and many other writers, apart from the one I mentioned, and so I hope but that it means, yeah. So it's really about, it's about books, but I think you'll get a sense, people who've read this book have said, I'm glad you've quoted him at such length, because he's such a wonderful prose stylist. Now, Rukun, I should say, for the record, he wrote his Cambridge PhD, was published as a book. It's called E.M. Foster's Critic. It was an analysis of E.M. Foster's non-fiction writings. Then he published a novel called Beethoven Among the Cows, which has some interesting parts, but doesn't really cohere, but there's some 1 or 2 chapters are quite good. Then he wrote a wonderful column in the Hindu called Loose Cannon, which is delightful. There were 200 of those published. Then he would write reviews here and there, I remember a beautiful review he wrote of Robert Canigel's Ramanujam. How many here have read that book? It was a wonderful biography, right? Now, of the mathematician Ramanujan. And the review started by, which a remark only Rukun could have written. He said in the year, I forget, 1913, 2 great Cambridge scholars got an unsolicited mail from a stranger they'd never known. Bernard Russell, the greatest philosopher of his time, got a mail from an unknown Austrian, wanting to be a philosopher. G.H. Hardy, the leading British mathematician of his time, got a mail from an unknown Indian who wanted to be a mathematician. And the unknown people were Wittgenstein and Ramanujan, respectively. And then Rukun continued. He said, in both cases, the great scholar at Cambridge read the mail, read it again, furrowed his brow and tickled his brain and said, is this guy an imposter, crank, or may he just be a genius? And finally, they inclined to the last and called that person. So Russell called Wittgenstein, who transformed modern philosophy. And Hardy called Ramanujan, who transformed modern mathematics. And only Rukun could have begun his review with this comparison. I can tell you that. Right. So that was the quality of his writing. And so it's just multiple reasons why he just completely stopped writing for the press. When Ravi Dayal died, he wrote something. When a great printer in Kolkata called P.K. Ghosh died, he wrote something, but he should have had a good column in the Hindu. But he's a wonderful prose stylist. So, as you'll see from the letters quoted here.
Okay, perhaps I can ask the last question. Ram, can you just mention the dedication and what Rukun said when he read it?
Huh?
Could you just mention the dedication to the book and what Rukun said when you showed it to him?
Okay. So the dedication is for Sujata, my second best editor. And Rukun said I loved it because I'm not on the page, and yet I'm on the page. But since you asked, Sandhya, let me conclude by reading out the epigraph, because questions have been asked about editing. The epigraph is from an American writer and editor called Norman Podhoretz. So Norman Podhoretz is known mostly as a writer of right-wing, very elegant writer, but a writer of right-wing books defending American adventurism abroad. But he was a great editor before that of a magazine called Commentary, which was one of the most important magazines of American intellectual life in the 60s and 70s. And this is what he wrote about editors, and I'll just end my talk by reading this epigraph. Good editors, really good editors, are very rare. In fact, even rarer than good writers. It's a special kind of talent because it takes two qualities that rarely go together in the same person. On the one hand, great arrogance, and on the other hand, great selflessness. The arrogance lies in the fact that you, the editor, think he knows better than the author, who is usually a specialist on how to say what it is he wants to say. The humility or selflessness, which is very important, is that you're willing to lend your talents to someone else's work without getting any credit for it.